role that you've had so far as the Executive Director of TTC's Innovation and Sustainability Program, which I think is a fantastic title. And we truly hope that most agencies down the road in the next 10 years will create similar types of divisions, departments, and titled roles to really situate at the forefront the sustainability of their transit fleets. So through this, for those of you who are not as familiar with the TTC programming, BEM is directly accountable for the stewardship of a 15-year, $10 billion portfolio of capital programs, which include the delivery of TTC's vehicle procurements, overhauls, and the entire complicated electrical infrastructure. So BEM, welcome to the digital stage today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sipa, for having me.
Well, I should also say, take a moment to shine in your spotlight. Bem was one of our directors on the board of directors of QTRIC for several years, and we really benefited from all the knowledge that TTC was gaining as your agency was going through the early years of electrification and the first procurement. And now we have, of course, Michelle Davies at the table as one of our, Michelle Jones yeah. At the table as one of our directors. Michelle Davies is our fractional COO, but too many Michelles in the mix. Nonetheless, a fantastic Michelle Davies at the cabinet. That's how me expecting my own future at the table of our board of directors, planning out the future of really what we see as the country. So thanks to yourself, Bem, and to Michelle for your leadership from TTC at our board of directors level. So what we're going to do today, we've got a few minutes to go a little bit more deep dive into not the technical aspects, that's going to come up in the panel that's coming up this afternoon, but more the policy aspects for those agencies that are at the beginning or the middle or want to learn a little bit more about how the larger agency did it and what's coming forward. So maybe I'm going to turn to you first, Ben, from the position of the electrification of TTC. It's a pretty obvious question for us to ask, why is electrification important? But I'm going to ask you anyhow, and I'm going to ask you to kind of dig into the history of why was it so important years ago when nobody was doing it? Because 5-6 years ago, nobody was doing it. And there were 10,000 reasons to not want to do it. And the money was not there. And there was no indication federally or provincially that the money would be there. So can you walk us through why TTC decided to move down this pathway in those early years?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I think it's important to repeat this message over the coming years because obviously it's a broad suite of benefits that we're looking to capitalize on through the investments. Everybody understands that there's a big capital investment, but there's a huge broad suite of potential benefits. And obviously there's environmental, there's operational performance, there's fiscal stewardship, public health, social equity, and leadership is the way I'd kind of frame it. On environmental, one of the biggest things that an individual can do to reduce their impact on climate change is to decide on how best to get around. They take active transportation, take public transit, buy an EV as kind of like the tiers, if you will. So the biggest thing that a transit agency can do can actually to make those choices the fastest choice, as well as the most economical choice. And transit has a role in all three of those modes, if you will. But the second largest thing that we can do is to green our own operations. And for this includes the transition of our fleet to zero emissions fleet, fossil fuel free. And we have the potential, we're on the path already, in fact, to reducing our emissions by 200 to 250,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. The goal of which, of course, ultimately isn't just to reduce the emissions, but is in fact to reduce the impact on the environment, on wildlife, on people living in coastal cities, on the effects of climate change on our own operations through extreme weather events. So there's a huge suite of benefits even within that kind of environmental bucket. Under vehicle performance, a simpler vehicle should result in, and we are starting to see, and I'll present at the later session, some data, increased reliability and increased fleet availability that should exceed the diesel bus. Fiscal stewardship, of course, I mentioned this to increase capital costs, but there's reduced maintenance costs. There's significant reduction in fuel costs. Our initial projections fuel savings was around $50 to $80 million per year. That was based on 2018 dollars and wasn't escalated. Our newer models, which escalate, but then also take into consideration a much broader range on diesel costs, given all the uncertainties in the market, and based on some predictions out of the United States, suggests that we can greatly exceed this in savings and cost avoidance going forward. so the possibility is there for an overall lower life cycle cost, and we're going to present out to our board in June on what we think that looks like. On health, when the city goes zero emissions on its fleet, we're looking at 29 premature deaths avoided per year, and many more hospitalizations avoided. This results in, I mean, obviously that is in itself makes it worthwhile, frankly. But in addition to that, or as a result of that, we're looking at maybe over $180 million in healthcare savings each year. That's estimated by C40 and Toronto Public Health. Equity, given that neighborhood improvement areas have traditionally been underserved by higher orders of transit. Zero emissions buses promise to improve health outcomes of the city's poorest residents the most. From a leadership perspective, given that TTC is the largest transit agency in Canada, I think we have a responsibility to take a lead in the adoption and advancement of these technologies and to bring all of these benefits. So it's for all these reasons that we embarked on this and continue to kind of go full force down this path.
So it's kind of a quintuple bottom line, more than just those straight up.
It is.
Let's unpack a couple of those, because some of those are really interesting, and a lot of agencies are just starting on the will the bus run out of power question. Mm-hmm. And they haven't gotten to the stage of how many dead babies can we actually save from asthma attacks, right? And like you're going all that way. So if we were to unpack a couple things, let's start with the financial side of the equation. When we started doing some modeling at Cutrick years ago, we asked agencies, give us your 10-year diesel price, like a 10-year average. Yeah. And people might forget that in 2005 and 2006, 2007, oil was through the roof. People were paying, like agencies were paying $1.35, $1.40, for diesel for a liter. And then it dropped after the recession and it came down to like 60 cents and 80 cents and 90 cents. And we really advocated, like, let us use $1 a liter. And there was a lot of pushback that it's too expensive. It's too expensive. Well, even $1 a liter, was in our view very low,
very conservative,
very conservative with carbon pricing and uncertainties in the supply chain. Fast forward to where we are now, very conservative. And that doesn't even include, forget supply chain disruptions. There's a very predictable carbon price out there. There's an extremely predictable increase in the actual delta for the next 10, 15 years. And it's really unlikely that a federal government will get elected in the next while from any political party that would undo that completely to zero. Like the horse has left the stable, right? So from your perspective, financially, you guys have taken into account supply chain disruption, current pricing, maybe some carbon pricing. Can you walk us through all of the pricing assumptions that really are critical to a city council?
Well, I mean, so we hedge the cost of the diesel pricing. So we have a contract right now. We're paying just over $1 a liter. It's it's usually a 5-year contract. When we look at predicting the cost of diesel, I'm not going to. So I've looked into all the things you mentioned, and I've concluded that it's beyond our ability to come up with a precise estimate of what it's going to cost for a liter of diesel in 2040, right? So which is kind of our life cycle cost analysis. When we're doing net present value analysis, we're looking at 2040, maybe a little bit beyond that. So when you've got some steady state years with a full zero emissions fleet. But certainly when you look at the dollar that we secured before COVID, and we look at the price of diesel now, which is closer to $2 than it is $1. Because of recent events, of course, because of COVID, as well as because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. And then you also look at analysis done recently by, and I'm going to get it wrong, but there's an information agency, it's a think tank in the States that focuses on energy sector. And it's a government agency, and they're predicting a doubling or perhaps even tripling of diesel costs. It's fairly linear, as you describe. It's not actually factoring in all the kind of political variability that you might see, but just based on the carbon increase of price, you're looking at doubling or tripling by 2040. And so we decided going into the June report to use $1.50 as the assumed dollar, but then also to be clear that we're talking about a range, quite a wide range on diesel costs. But when you look at $1.50, those numbers I mentioned earlier, 50 to 80 million dollars per year, you're looking at anywhere between 50% more savings than that, or even doubling the savings.
Mm-hmm.
And those are annual savings, right? So when you factor that in, not to mention the healthcare savings, which I know that you touched on, of estimated $180 million, when you add all of these things up and you look at the full economic case, not just TTC's own payback period, let's say, then again, it's a no-brainer. In both cases, if you look at TTC on its own as an entity, as well as you look at the role that this action takes in broader society, again, it's no-brainer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really exciting to hear. Now, there's a whole other dialogue we can have, and we will at our next conference, about the potential increase in the price of electricity and what's going to happen in the price of electricity. And that is very hard to predict. I don't know if there's been analysis on your end in terms of like the basic assumptions that can unfold, but certainly in Ontario, there's this looming dialogue that right now the prices are artificially low because they're being subsidized. And when that lid gets taken off, we already pay fairly high prices, and those prices are going to go up. They're going to have to go up. And that this is kind of the hidden story of not telling voters exactly how much electricity costs these days, because we're hiding it effectively, right? And the question that we always get is that going to increase just as much as diesel? And our mathematics show probably not. Like, probably when you add up all the costs, even the commodity doubling or tripling, it's not going to undo the savings of the electrification. But there's something to consider there. So I wanted to kind of turn it to you to see what the thought there is in Toronto Hydro and OPG.
Yeah, so I assume also that there will continue to be an incentive to use electricity off peak hours. So even if those even if both sets of rates go up, there'll still be that incentive. And so we're building an infrastructure where we're essentially transferring all of our, or as much of our energy consumption as possible off of peak hours to night hours through energy storage. So we'll be able to mitigate that risk quite significantly that way. So regardless of how that turns out, assuming, and there's a base assumption here, that there is still some time of day use pricing model, then we'll be okay. If the pricing continues to goes up on average, let's say, as high as diesel continues to go up, then we'll still see the savings that we initially estimated.
Exactly. So, and I think you're quite right. Like, the industry trend in electricity is time of use pricing to encourage consumption reduction. So we have a lot of opportunity there, and we're going to come back to that in our June conference with a lot more utility panels to see how they're planning for that. I do want to spend a couple minutes now on the health equation. Doing that health equation, like I've often said, there's the dead babies equation out there. How many people are dying? How many kids are dying, getting sick because of the fumes that they're breathing in? And it's something that for long the auto sector has said, look, that's not relevant because gasoline doesn't produce the same kind of noxious particulate matter. Yeah, but diesel does. And even with clean diesel, it does. And if you're in downtown Toronto, I mean, how many condos are built along the QEW, and it stinks and it's horrible. And you go for a run and your lungs are black. Like, there's no doubt about that. So those calculations are really important, but cities don't carry the cost of healthcare, provinces do. So can you walk us through a little bit about, that's a great news story. Who's listening to that story? Because I imagine like the provincial health ministry would be interested, but what is the uptake of that story?
Yeah. So I think, so I've shared that analysis with the province through its Transportation Electrification Council. When I was engaged with that council, it was kind of under an NDA in a way, confidentiality. So I don't know how much I can share beyond that, but I can tell you that the message was made loud and clear by me and others that this is one of those very significant benefits of electrification of transportation more widely, because as you rightly point out, it's not just about transit in this case. We're talking about diesel trucks moving goods, which is a huge emitter, and that diesel particulate is a known carcinogen. So we need to kind of acknowledge that and not shy away from it. And in our case, our hybrid buses, and we just issued a contract award for the next 300 plus hybrid buses to come in next year. And so that'll bring our fleet up to just under 600 hybrid electric buses. And they're geofenced, they're being geofenced to go into EV mode when they're in the garages or when they're in stations. So in areas where people are affected most by idling by those fumes, we're geofencing in EV mode. So it won't have the environmental impact that going to zero emissions bus will have, but it will have some of those health benefits as early as, well, now, in fact, with our hybrid buses that we have today and the additional ones we're getting tomorrow. So
Yeah,
my
and
point,
in your garage, right? In your
the
garage, which
garage, these are the
that's
people who
like,
are exposed to it the most, right?
yeah,
So so there are huge benefits there, and we've been making that clear to the province. I'm hopeful that the message gets from the kind of transportation policy folks who are involved in those forums to the Ministry of Health as well,
for sure.
because there's a real benefit to investment by the province in this.
Yeah, it sounds like we have some work to do as well. I mean, there was years ago when I said, I think this is basically what's going to win it for us down the road. Now, happily, we've got a lot of federal funding, but across the country, we have 10 provinces, 3 territories, and not all provinces are stepping up. But this story could help motivate that step up. So I'm going to go then into some of the challenges. Like if we take a look at, there's a lot of money federally now, like that has been one, and that's going to hopefully stick. There's a municipal commitment. Nobody's denying climate at the local level. And then you've got this quadruple, quintuple bottom line narrative that's beautiful and justifies it all. But we've learned over the years that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And in these early deployments, a lot of stuff does go wrong, and it does create challenges. Can you walk us through the big challenges now? If money isn't the big challenge and the narrative of the business case isn't the big challenge, what are the biggest challenge now going forward for TTC?
Well, I would say that money still is a challenge. I mean, we're talking about we have about $1.6 billion of unfunded need just in the bus procurement program alone, and additional unfunded need of just bear with me a second while I draw this out. It's somewhere around $500 million of additional funds needed for electrification, over and above the funding that we have secured through the City of Toronto's City Building Fund. And so we are very hopeful to see, we're very hopeful in that conversations with the federal government, as you mentioned, have been very positive so far, and we're hopeful that we can leverage those city funds to gain federal funds. But the gaps I'm describing are still huge, right? And there's a lot of uncertainty still when you go out just so, even if we are successful at getting this round of federal funding, for example, it brings us to 2027, and that's it, right? So in the planning and electrification infrastructure that's required, that needs to be in place and commissioned and tested 6 months in advance of vehicles coming, roughly. And as we look to the portion of the fleet that we need a long-range solution for, that may not come out of the depots, but it might be en route, or it might be hydrogen fuel cell, the lead times are going to be even longer. So we have to work back. We have to have even longer work back schedules. So there is still a need to focus on closing that gap, because it is still a significant challenge. Anyway, so interestingly, one of the things that came to mind when you asked the question is, what is our obligation in an emergency situation? I think I may have mentioned this before, but in another forum. But so we have some obligations to help evacuate the Pickering area if there's a nuclear incident. We have obligations to evacuate our own subway system if there's a long-term hydro outage, let's say, and the subway system is down or the streetcar system is down. And just understanding for how long the bus fleet, the electric bus fleet now, needs to be available to serve those responsibilities is not that straightforward. and we're still trying to figure out what the answer to that question is, because the answer to that question determines how many tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars we need to invest in energy storage and natural gas emergency backup generation, and like all of that infrastructure required to ensure the resiliency of fleet operations. So that remains a big challenge for us. The technical challenges around the bus or the infrastructure itself, they're there, but they're being managed. And you'll see in the session later that as we presented to the ZEB conference about a year ago, following the first year of our head-to-head evaluation of the 3 bus manufacturers that we had engaged with for the buses we have today, that the fewer than 5%, in fact, fewer than 4% of vehicle failures are propulsion related. And the vast majority of failures are still doors, suspension, HVAC systems, etc. And so when they fail, sometimes it takes longer to resolve that issue because it takes engineering expertise that we don't necessarily have right away, that the OEMs are relying in some cases on a supplier who supplies the propulsion system. And we need people on site to mitigate that risk, and we need parts on site or at least stored locally to be able to mitigate that risk to the fleet availability. So we have that continues to be a risk, but it is being managed, and contractually in our next procurement we'll ensure that it's managed even better.
I mean, the great thing about what you've said is it sounds like the challenges are getting more and more precise to the detailed operations of the system and less about the philosophical need to move forward with the overhaul, which is, where we were a few years ago. And that's great. And I know we don't have a lot of time, but I did want to ask you, in that overall play, hydrogen's going to probably have to play a role, and including whether it's emergency services and backup, but just by the laws of physics, TTC, in terms of its operations. And across the country, we are seeing the challenge everybody's facing: no sustainable, scalable green hydrogen supply. Whether you're Halifax or Winnipeg or Edmonton or Calgary, you are facing the same issue that Mississauga is facing. Where are you going to get your green, sustainable, scalable hydrogen supply at a price point that right now is equivalent to diesel? Doesn't exist. At a price point in the next 5 years, maybe, but somebody's got to kind of crack the ice and be the first one out there and start growing it. And so that's really in the developmental stage. Can you walk us through in the next 2 minutes, basically, what's the leadership played there for hydrogen for TTC? What are the big challenges?
Well, we don't know if it's necessarily hydrogen fuel cell that fills that need for the longest range buses, or if it's opportunity charged battery electric buses. It could be either. We're certainly open to either. When it comes to opportunity charge buses, we understand what the solutions are, and so that's a big part of it. Like we can see how we could electrify the remainder of our fleet to get to 100% electrification through opportunity charge buses. As you say, for hydrogen fuel cell, we just don't see the scalable solution as yet. It is a great technical solution. There's no question about it. But how do you get enough green hydrogen, and how do you transport that in a green way as well to our facilities at a somewhat reasonable cost? I mean, we're not expecting it to be as cheap as electricity. We'll pay a premium, frankly, over the cost of electricity per kilometer, like unit energy per kilometer, for hydrogen, if that is a solution to the long range routes of our fleet, without having to increase our fleet size or have to do other things through block splitting and these types of things, right? So we'll pay a premium to do that, but we won't pay 10 times as much. Yeah, we're not going to pay 5 times as much, right? Then we'll just go en route.
Yeah, and on that note, hopefully we will get our Mississauga bus project out the door, and the whole promise of that is trying to scale from 10 to 30 and from 30 to 100 to get that price point down and then create that hub and spoke model. So let's see what we can do through innovation. It's certainly not off the shelf ready, but it's exactly where we play, and we're hoping to learn as much as possible with you, Bem, as TTC gets into what I would say next generation electrification, which is into those detailed steps of precision deployment. So thank you for your time today. I think we've all learned a lot, and we're certainly going to continue learning a lot from the mass deployment that TTC is initiating across the country. Congratulations for your leadership and for your role in your division, and also congratulations to the whole TTC team for really transforming everything in the last 5 years. Like, it's been a complete overhaul. So congrats to you all.
Thank you.
And thank you. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you at our next panel.